The moment I heard the front door of my ranch house splinter and crash open, I knew something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my shotgun from behind the door, only to be met by a mob of HOA board members storming into my living room like a SWAT team. At the front of the group was Rick Miller, the self-proclaimed HOA president, waving a bright red piece of paper in his hand and barking orders like a war general. "By order of the Green Valley Ranch HOA," Rick shouted, "all privately owned firearms are now banned. This is a mandatory gun seizure for the safety of the community." I stood there frozen in disbelief, wondering if I was trapped in some kind of bad dream. I lived on a private 30-acre ranch that had been passed down from my grandfather. I wasn't even supposed to be part of the HOA, or so I thought. Before I could open my mouth to argue, two board members yanked the shotgun right out of my hands. Another one pushed past me into the hallway where my gun cabinet stood, the keys still hanging from the lock. I lunged forward, shouting, "You can't do this! This is theft! This is illegal!" Rick smirked and said, "Inside the HOA, your so-called Second Amendment rights don't mean squat. Read the new bylaw we voted. You lost." I stood there in shock as they raided my home like I was a criminal, stealing my guns before I could do anything to stop them. They had emptied my entire gun cabinet, my late father's deer rifle, my prized collection of vintage handguns, even my old Civil War replica, musket that had never fired a bullet. They piled everything into the back of a beat-up HOA maintenance van parked outside. Neighbors stood on the gravel driveway watching. Some looked horrified, others just shook their heads like it was no big deal. I stood there in a cloud of dust as the van drove away, taking everything I had to protect my home. Rick grinned like he had just won the lottery. "Better get used to it," he sneered. "You're living under my rules now." And then he was gone, leaving me staring at the empty gun cabinet, my fists clenched so tightly they turned white, my heart hammering in my chest. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. What Rick had done wasn't just illegal, it was personal. He had a plan for my ranch, a plan that would turn my entire life upside down. But before I could even think about fighting back, I had to figure out how in the world the HOA had claimed control over my ranch in the first place. It all started about 6 months ago, right after I inherited the property from my late grandfather, Thomas Walker. Grandpa Tom had owned the land since the 1950s, back when it was nothing but rolling hills and open fields. When he bought it, there wasn't a single house for miles, just ranchers, farmers, and hard-working families living off the land. But times had changed. Suburban sprawl had crept in like a slow-moving flood, and now, less than half a mile down the dirt road, a shiny new subdivision called Green Valley Ranch Estates had sprung up. Cookie-cutter homes with white picket fences, perfectly trimmed lawns, and neighbors who peeked through their windows every time you sneezed. At first, I didn't pay them any mind. My ranch was fenced off, I had a private well, my own driveway, and more acres than I knew what to do with. I figured as long as I kept to myself, the HOA nonsense wouldn't touch me. I was wrong. One afternoon, a fancy letter showed up in my mailbox, gold embossed like it was some kind of wedding invitation. It was from the Green Valley Ranch Estates HOA. It claimed that under a recently expanded community covenant, my land, yes, my private land, was now officially part of the HOA. They said that because my grandfather had signed a vague community cooperation agreement decades ago, and because the county had rezoned part of the land for residential expansion, my ranch was now under their jurisdiction. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. No way was I going to pay monthly dues to some nosy group who wanted to tell me what color to paint my barn, but ignoring them didn't make them go away. Over the next few months, the HOA started, making my life miserable. They fined me for unauthorized livestock, meaning my cattle. They fined me for unsightly landscaping, meaning my fields. They even tried to fine me for having dangerous wildlife, because a family of deer liked to roam through my back pasture at sunset. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just empty threats. But then things got serious. First, they sent a man named Carl, the HOA compliance officer, to take photos of my property. Carl was a skinny guy with a clipboard who drove a golf cart like he was on a SWAT mission. I caught him snapping pictures near my barn one afternoon. "Hey, get off my land," I yelled, storming toward him. Carl jumped, nearly dropping his clipboard, and squeaked, "You're in violation," before zooming off down my driveway like a scared rabbit. After that, they started mailing me fake violation notices every week. It was like a slow drip of harassment. I began keeping a file of them, thinking I might need it if I ever had to get a lawyer. But nothing. Nothing compared to what happened when Rick Miller became HOA president. Rick was a retired lawyer with too much free time and a thirst for power. He had moved into Green Valley Ranch Estates 2 years ago and immediately ran for president, promising safety and security for all residents, which apparently meant banning every gun in sight. According to Rick, firearms were threats to public peace and promoted violence. So he pushed for a new bylaw that forbade all firearm ownership within HOA territory, even on private property. It passed, barely. That's when he decided to make an example out of me. The day they raided my ranch, Rick posted everything on the neighborhood Facebook page, pictures of the seized guns, boasts about how the HOA was making the community safer. My blood boiled. I sat on the porch that evening, staring out across the empty fields, the same fields my grandfather had worked with his bare hands. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Rick get away with this. Not just because he had stolen from me. Not just because he was trampling on my rights, but because deep down I knew if I didn't fight back, it wouldn't stop with me. It would be my neighbors next, my friends, maybe even the whole town. Still, I had to be smart about it. Rick was cunning. He had the HOA board eating out of his hand. If I charged in guns blazing, pun intended, they would just paint me as the crazy cowboy who couldn't follow the rules. No, if I was going to win this, I needed a plan, a real plan, and I needed allies. I decided to start with the people who had stood on my driveway that day, the ones who looked horrified. Maybe they weren't as loyal to Rick as they seemed. Maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to him. But as I sat there plotting my next move, a pickup truck pulled up to the house. It was Carl, the scrawny compliance officer, and he wasn't alone. 2 uniformed private security guards climbed out of the back, their shirts emblazoned with the Green Valley Ranch Estates logo. They weren't cops. They weren't even licensed security. They were just HOA goons. Carl marched up to my porch, waving another piece of paper. "This is a notice of pending eviction," he said nervously. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." My jaw dropped. Eviction? Before I could respond, one of the guards grabbed a hammer and nailed the notice right to the front of my house. It was official now. The HOA wasn't just trying to steal my gun. They were trying to steal my home. And the worst part was, they thought they could actually get away with it. I stood there on the porch, watching the dust cloud rise as they drove away, feeling more alone than I had in my entire life. But deep inside, something was awakening, a fire I hadn't felt since the days when Grandpa Tom taught me how to fix a broken fence with nothing but wire and willpower. They had declared war, and they had no idea who they were messing with. The sun dipped low behind the hills as I stared at the eviction notice, the nail still quivering from the force of the hammer. My chest tightened, and for a split second, I thought about giving up, just packing a bag and walking away from everything Grandpa Tom had left me. But then I remembered the look in Rick Miller's eyes that afternoon. The smugness, the hunger for control. He didn't just want the ranch. He wanted to make an example out of me, to show the whole neighborhood that no one could stand against him. I folded the notice carefully and tucked it into my back pocket. I wasn't running. Not now, not ever. First, I needed information. If they were threatening eviction, there had to be paperwork filed with the county, legal filings, hearings, something. Real eviction wasn't as easy as tacking up a paper and kicking someone off their land, no matter what Rick thought. I grabbed my truck keys and headed straight for town. The county clerk's office closed at 6 here, and if I hurried, I could just make it. The drive into town was tense. Every bump in the dirt road felt like a drumbeat pounding in my ears. When I finally screeched into the county parking lot, I sprinted across the pavement, pushing through the heavy glass doors just as the clerk was flipping the open sign to closed. "Wait," I called out, breathless. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Doris, who had known my family for years, peered over her glasses. "Mason Walker, what's got you looking like you're being chased by a grizzly?" I slapped the eviction notice onto the counter. "Can you check if there's anything filed against my property? Anything at all?" Doris frowned and tapped away on her ancient computer. After a moment, her eyes widened. "You're not going to believe this," she said in a low voice. "There's a pending lien filed by Green Valley Ranch Estates, HOA." "A lien?" I repeated, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. She nodded grimly. "It claims you owe over $30,000 in fines for noncompliance with HOA regulations. They filed it 2 weeks ago. They're using it to justify eviction." $30,000. Fines for what? Owning cattle? Having a broken fence post? Breathing? I gritted my teeth. "Can I fight it?" Doris leaned in closer. "It's fishy, Mason. Real fishy. They're claiming jurisdiction based on some cooperation agreement from 1979, but you're not listed under the HOA's original charter boundaries. Not even close." My heart lifted for the first time all day. "So it's bogus?" "It sure looks that way," she said, "but you'll need a good lawyer to untangle it fast." I thanked her and bolted back to the truck, my mind racing. I had 72 hours. I needed legal help, and I needed it yesterday. The next morning, after a sleepless night pacing the living room, I drove to the office of Sam Jenkins, an old friend of Grandpa Tom's and one of the best property lawyers in the county. Sam was a bulldog in a wrinkled suit with a voice that could shake courtroom walls. He listened quietly as I explained everything: the sudden expansion of the HOA boundaries, the fake fines, the gun seizure, and now the eviction threat. When I finally finished, Sam leaned back in his chair, his mouth pressed into a thin, angry line. "They can't do this, Mason," he said. "Not legally, not even close." "Then why are they getting away with it?" I asked. "Because bullies thrive on fear," Sam said. "They push until someone pushes back." He tapped his desk. "We'll file an emergency injunction to stop the eviction. We'll also sue for illegal seizure of property and civil rights violations." The words sounded good, real good, but deep down I knew Rick wasn't going to roll over easy. He had his claws deep into the HOA, into the subdivision, maybe even into the local politicians. Sam stood up and clapped me on the back. "Don't worry. We're going to hit them so hard they'll think a tornado rolled through." I left Sam's office feeling lighter. Hope was a powerful thing. But the moment I pulled into my driveway, that hope was nearly crushed. Rick was there, standing on my porch, grinning like he owned the place. Beside him stood Carl and 2 new HOA security guards. Bigger, meaner-looking ones, their arms crossed over their chests. Rick stepped forward and said, "We heard you went to the county, Mason. That's cute." I clenched my fists. "Get off my property." Rick chuckled. "Oh, I'm afraid it's not your property anymore. Not once the eviction finalizes." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black object. At first, I thought it was a weapon. It was worse. It was a padlock. Rick sauntered over to my barn and snapped the padlock onto the doors. Then he waved a piece of paper in the air. "By the authority of the Green Valley Ranch Estates HOA," he said loudly, making sure the handful of gawking neighbors nearby could hear, "this structure is now sealed pending property forfeiture." I felt like I was going to explode. They had locked up my barn with my tools, my equipment, and the last pieces of my grandfather's legacy trapped inside. I lunged forward, but one of the guards stepped between us, his hand resting on a taser strapped to his belt. Rick leaned in close, his voice low and mocking. "Careful, cowboy. You wouldn't want to add assault to your list of crimes, would you?" I had never wanted to hit a man so badly in my life, but Sam's words echoed in my head. "They want you to lose your temper. Don't let them." I stepped back. Rick gave a mocking bow. "See you in court, Mr. Walker." And with that, they piled into a convoy of golf carts and pickup trucks and disappeared down the road. I stood there, fists shaking, staring at the locked barn door. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was war. And Rick had just fired the next shot. The metal padlock on my barn gleamed under the sun like a trophy Rick had stolen. I stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a mountain. My fists ached from clenching so hard, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I lost control now, I'd be playing right into Rick's hands. I needed a plan, a smart one. That evening, I called Sam Jenkins again. After I explained what happened, he didn't even try to hide his anger. "They can't seal your property without a legal court order, Mason," he growled, "and they sure as hell can't seize your personal belongings." "What do we do?" I asked, feeling desperate. "We file an emergency motion first thing in the morning," Sam said. "I'll draft it tonight. Meanwhile, don't touch the lock. Let them hang themselves with their own stupidity." I thanked him and hung up. It wasn't easy, but I followed his advice. I left the barn alone, even though every bone in my body screamed to rip that lock off and throw it at Rick's smug face. Instead, I focused on rallying support. I printed out copies of the so-called cooperation agreement the HOA was using against me and highlighted every section that proved my ranch was outside the original boundaries. Then I started going door to door around the subdivision. At first, the neighbors were wary. Some closed their doors before I even finished talking. Others shook their heads and muttered about not getting involved. But a few, just a few, listened. Mrs. Langford, an elderly widow who lived alone at the end of Meadowbrook Lane, invited me inside and made me a cup of tea. "I never liked that Rick fellow," she said, setting down 2 steaming mugs. "Too slick, too bossy. Your grandfather was a good man. Helped my late husband fix our roof once, free of charge. I'll help you however I can." By nightfall, I had a small list of people willing to sign affidavits, people who remembered Grandpa Tom, people who didn't trust Rick and his cronies. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, I met Sam at the courthouse. He filed the emergency motion to stop the eviction and challenge the HOA's lien. We managed to get a temporary restraining order against the HOA, preventing them from taking further action until a full hearing could be held. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. When I got back home, there was a bright orange notice stapled to my fence. Notice of fine, $5,000 for unauthorized assembly. Apparently, the HOA considered me gathering neighbors to talk about my case and illegal assembly that violated their made-up rules. I laughed out loud. The desperation was showing, but my good mood didn't last long. That afternoon, while I was mending a fence line at the edge of my property, I heard the sound of an engine. I looked up and saw a familiar truck rumbling down the dirt road. Rick. He wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat a man in a sharp suit, someone I didn't recognize. They parked by my mailbox and got out. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. Rick had that oily grin plastered across his face. "Mason, meet Mr. Ellis. He's a land developer very interested in your former ranch," Rick said. I narrowed my eyes. "Former," Rick ignored the comment. "Mr. Ellis is prepared to offer you a generous sum to vacate voluntarily. Save everyone the hassle." Mr. Ellis extended a hand and smiled thinly. $500,000 cash, close in 30 days. For a split second, the number stunned me. $500,000 could change my life. But then I thought of Grandpa Tom, of the years he spent building this place, of the sunsets we watched together, from the porch, of everything. This land meant not just to me, but to my family's legacy. I shook my head slowly. Not for all the money in the world. Mr. Ellis's smile tightened. It's a fair offer. I barked a humorless laugh. Fair? After you tried to steal my guns, lock my barn, slap fake fines on me, and threaten to evict me. Rick's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Mason. I stepped closer, meeting his glare. No, Rick, you made the mistake. You thought you could bully a man off his own land. I turned and walked away without another word, leaving them standing in the dust. But deep down, I knew the fight was far from over. That night, things got worse. I woke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept to the window and saw 3 trucks idling by the barn. Figures moved in the dark, working quickly. I threw on my boots and charged. Outside, heart hammering. As I got closer, the flashlight beam caught them. A group of HOA thugs in matching security shirts, crowbars in hand, trying to pry the barn doors open. You better have a death wish, I shouted. The men froze. One of them, the big one who had guarded Rick the day they locked the barn, snarled and stepped forward. You're trespassing, I bellowed. Get off my property. Another man raised his crowbar threateningly, and that's when I saw it. Behind them, in the back of one of the trucks, stacked carelessly, were my guns, my stolen guns. They were trying to move them, probably to hide the evidence before the court hearing. Adrenaline flooded my veins. I didn't think, I reacted. I reached for the old bullwhip hanging by the barn entrance, a relic Grandpa Tom had used for cattle herding. With a crack like thunder, I snapped it through the air just inches from the lead thug's hand. He yelped and stumbled back. You're committing breaking and entering, theft, destruction of private property, I roared. Police are on their way. It was a bluff. My phone was still inside the house, but they didn't know that. The men hesitated, exchanged glances, then bolted. I chased them halfway down the driveway, shouting threats and waving the whip like a madman until their taillights disappeared into the night. Panting, heart-pounding, I stood alone under the stars, my barn still locked, but my spirit burning. Brighter than ever. They weren't just trying to bankrupt me, they were trying to erase me, but I wasn't going anywhere. And next time they came for me, I was going to be ready. The next morning, I barely slept. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise over the hills like it had for generations before me. This land wasn't just dirt and fences. It was my family's blood, sweat, and soul, and I wasn't about to let Rick Miller or anyone else steal it without a fight. First thing after sunrise, I called Sheriff Bradshaw. Sheriff Bradshaw was a mountain of a man with a thick mustache and a voice like gravel. He had known Grandpa Tom and had a reputation for being fair, though he also hated getting involved in HOA squabbles. Still, I figured it was worth a shot. When Bradshaw picked up, I launched into everything: the gun seizure, the fake fines, the attempted theft the night before. I laid it all out. Sheriff Bradshaw listened quietly, then sighed. Mason, you know I don't like HOA business. It's usually civil, not criminal. But stealing your firearms and breaking into your barn, that's serious. I felt a flicker of hope. So you'll help? I asked. I'll send a deputy out today, Bradshaw said. We'll get statements, maybe even press charges if we can. I thanked him and hung up. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. By noon, Deputy Elena Marks showed up at the ranch. She was young, sharp-eyed, and all business. She walked through the property with me, taking pictures of the damaged barn doors, the padlock, and the tire tracks where the HOA thugs had fled. I told her about the stolen guns piled in the truck the night before, though by now they were gone. She nodded thoughtfully as she jotted down notes. Even if the HOA claims they had some bylaw authority, this is still theft. You can't just take someone's property without a court order. I could have hugged her. We'll open an investigation, Deputy Marks said. But be ready. These HOA types usually lawyer up fast. I nodded. I wasn't naive. Rick would fight dirty, but at least now there was an official record, something I could use. Later that afternoon, Sam Jenkins called. "Mason," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "The judge granted the temporary injunction. Effective immediately, the HOA can't fine you, evict you, or touch your property until the full hearing." I felt like a 1,000-pound weight had lifted off my shoulders. "And," Sam continued, "we subpoenaed the HOA's internal records. If they filed any fake liens or fabricated votes, we'll find out." Things were finally swinging in my favor. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. I spent the next few days reinforcing my fences, double-checking security cameras, and gathering support from the few neighbors brave enough to stand up. Word spread quickly. People started whispering about Rick's abuses, fines for imaginary violations, threats against homeowners who disagreed with him, misuse of HOA funds. It was like the whole house of cards was teetering, just waiting for a push. Still, Rick wasn't going down without a fight. One evening, just as I was fixing the front gate, a black SUV pulled up. Rick got out, but he wasn't alone. With him was a tall, stocky man in a black suit with a badge clipped to his belt, a federal agent. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward them slowly. Rick smiled like a cat that had caught a mouse. "Mason Walker, meet Agent Carter. He's with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. We had a little chat about your excessive gun collection," Rick said, his voice slick with satisfaction. My stomach turned. Agent Carter stepped forward. "All serious business. We received a report about unsecured, unregistered firearms stored improperly on this property. I'm here to conduct an inspection." It was a dirty move. Rick had called in the feds, hoping to bury me under red tape or trumped-up charges. I kept my voice steady. "Do you have a warrant?" Agent Carter paused, caught off guard. Rick jumped in quickly. "The HOA agreement allows inspections at any time," he said smugly. I cut him off. "Not on private property outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and definitely not without a legal warrant signed by a judge." Agent Carter studied me for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I'll get a warrant. Expect us back." Without another word, they turned and left. I watched them go, my fists trembling with anger. Rick wasn't just playing dirty anymore. He was trying to destroy me. I rushed inside and called Sam. After explaining everything, he cursed under his breath. "They're desperate, Mason," he said, "and desperation makes people reckless. We'll be ready." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights off and sat by the window with a loaded revolver, staring into the darkness, waiting. Nothing happened. But deep down, I knew this was just the calm before the storm. The next morning, while I was feeding the cattle, my phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Langford. "Mason," she whispered, panic in her voice. "You need to get to the community center now." "Why?" I asked. "They're holding an emergency HOA meeting about you. Rick's trying to force a vote to authorize a full property seizure." My blood ran cold. Without even changing out of my muddy boots, I jumped into my truck and tore down the dirt road toward Green Valley Ranch Estates. The community center was packed when I arrived. Neighbors, board members, even a few strangers I didn't recognize. At the front of the room, standing tall and smug, was Rick Miller. He tapped the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. "We are gathered here today to address an ongoing threat to the safety and harmony of our community, Mason Walker's defiance and lawlessness." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I pushed my way to the front. "You're lying," I shouted. Rick's eyes glittered with malice. "Mr. Walker, this is a closed meeting. You are trespassing." I planted my boots firmly. "This land you're trying to steal, it doesn't belong to the HOA, and you know it." The crowd shifted uneasily, some exchanging nervous glances. Rick smiled coldly. "Enough talk. Let's vote." He raised a clipboard high. "All in favor of authorizing a hostile takeover of Mason Walker's property, say aye." A few hands hesitated, then lifted. But before Rick could claim victory, the back doors burst open. Deputy Marks stormed in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. She raised a court order high over her head. "Stop this meeting immediately," she barked. Gasps filled the room. Rick's face turned ashen. Deputy Marks marched to the front and slammed the paper onto the podium. "This is a cease and desist order signed by Judge Harris. Any further action against Mason Walker will be considered harassment, property theft, and conspiracy." The room erupted in chaos. Shouts filled the air. Arguments broke out, and people abandoned their seats in a rush. Rick stood frozen at the front, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air. I stood tall, meeting his stunned gaze. For once, Rick Miller had nothing to say. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. He wouldn't give up that easily, and the worst was still to come. The moment Deputy Marks shut down the meeting, it was like someone had kicked a hornet's nest inside the community center. People shouted over one another, some trying to defend Rick, others demanding to know how deep the corruption went. The noise was deafening. I caught Rick trying to slip out, the side door unnoticed. I moved fast, stepping into his path and blocking him. "You're done, Rick," I said, my voice low but sharp. "The sheriff's involved. The court's involved. You're not going to bully your way out of this." For the first time since this nightmare began, Rick looked nervous. His hands twitched. At his sides, his face, usually smug, twisted with frustration and fear. But still, he forced a grin. "You think this changes anything, Mason? You're still a problem. Problems get dealt with." He shoved past me, knocking my shoulder hard as he stormed outside into the blinding sunlight. I stood there a moment longer, breathing hard. Every fiber of my being wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, to put an end to this once and for all. But I knew better now. Patience would win this war, not rage. Deputy Marks approached, tucking the court order back into her folder. "You did good holding your ground," she said. "We'll be keeping a closer eye on the situation now. I've already pulled body cam footage from the incident at your ranch. It's not looking good for Rick." That small reassurance kept me from unraveling completely. I headed back to the ranch, the long drive giving me time to think. Everything Rick had thrown at me, the fake fines, the gun theft, the illegal eviction, the padlocked barn, it was all falling apart piece by piece. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. And I was right. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard a low rumble outside. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped onto the porch. 2 black SUVs, their headlights off, crept up the driveway like sharks cutting through dark water. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could react, the SUVs stopped near the barn. Doors flew open and a group of masked men jumped out, armed with crowbars and bolt cutters. Hey, we're going after the barn again, but this time they weren't being sneaky about it. I ran inside and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Emergency," the operator answered. "This is Mason Walker at Green Valley Ranch," I shouted. "I'm under attack. They're trying to break into my barn again." "Units are on the way," she assured me. But I knew it would take at least 15 minutes for the nearest deputies to arrive. I couldn't just stand there and watch them destroy everything Grandpa Tom had built. I sprinted back outside and flipped the switch on the old floodlights he had installed years ago. Suddenly, the whole front yard lit up like a football stadium, blinding and harsh. The masked men froze like deer in headlights. I didn't hesitate. I marched forward, bullwhip in hand, my heart pounding like a drum. "You're trespassing on private property," I bellowed. "Get off my land." One of the men, a burly guy in a hoodie, pointed a crowbar at me. "You don't want to do this, old man," he snarled. I cracked the whip, the sound splitting the night like a gunshot. They flinched. And then, to my shock, Rick himself stepped out from behind one of the SUVs, unmasked and smirking. "You're outnumbered, Mason," he said calmly. "Walk away, and we'll forget this happened." "You're insane," I spat. "You think the law's not going to touch you?" Rick shrugged, casual as ever. "By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. and you'll be left with nothing but ashes." It hit me then. They weren't just trying to steal or harass anymore. They were planning to burn the barn, destroy evidence, wipe out my livelihood, maybe even take my home. I gripped the whip tighter. My brain raced for a plan. I just needed to stall them a little longer. "You'll never get away with this," I said, stepping forward slowly, forcing them to focus on me and not the barn. Rick laughed. "Who's going to stop me? You?" I smiled grimly. No. Right on cue, the sound of distant sirens cut through the night. Rick's face twisted in rage. "Scatter!" he screamed at his men. They bolted for the SUVs. One peeled out immediately, tires screeching on the gravel. The second SUV, the one Rick was heading for, stalled. Deputy Marks's cruiser came roaring down the driveway, lights flashing, siren blaring. Rick hesitated, glancing back at me before making a desperate break for the tree line on foot. I wasn't about to let him get away. I charged after him, adrenaline giving me wings. He was fast, but he didn't know the land like I did. I cut through the brush, circled wide, and intercepted him by the old cattle gate. Rick skidded to a stop, chest heaving. "You're done," I said, panting. He lunged at me, but I was ready. I sidestepped, stuck my boot out, and tripped him flat onto his face. By the time Rick rolled over, Deputy Marks was there, handcuffing him roughly as he sputtered and cursed. "You're under arrest," she said, reading him his rights for trespassing, attempted arson, destruction of private property, and theft. Rick glared up at me, pure hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over, Walker," he snarled. I leaned down close so only he could hear. "It is for you," I whispered. They hauled him to his feet and shoved him into the back of the cruiser. As the flashing lights disappeared down the road, I stood there in the moonlight, my chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. It was over, or at least it would be soon. There was still the court case to settle, still the matter of getting my stolen guns back, still the slow process of cleaning up the mess Rick had made of the community. But for the first time in a long while, I knew one thing for sure. They picked the wrong man to mess with, and I wasn't going anywhere. The morning of the court hearing dawned cool and bright, but I barely noticed the good weather. I was all ready, dressed in my best jeans, a clean button-down shirt, and the old leather boots Grandpa Tom used to call his Sunday boots. I wanted to walk into that courthouse not just as Mason Walker the rancher, but as the man fighting to protect his family's legacy. Sam Jenkins met me on the courthouse steps. He looked sharp in a Navy suit, clutching a battered leather briefcase stuffed with paperwork. "You ready for this?" he asked. I nodded, though my stomach churned like a storm was brewing inside. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors from Green Valley Ranch Estates filled the benches, whispering among themselves. Some shot me supportive glances. Others avoided my eyes. At the defense table sat Rick Miller, looking far less smug than usual. His expensive suit couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes or the tension in his clenched jaw. Sitting beside him was a high-priced attorney from the city, flipping through papers like he couldn't believe he'd gotten stuck handling an HOA mess in the middle of nowhere. Judge Harris entered, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Judge Harris gavelled the court back to order, her sharp glare sweeping the room like a storm warning. "Let it be known," she said, "that the law is not a weapon to be used for personal vendettas. Mr. Walker, you have the thanks of this court for standing your ground under extraordinary pressure." I nodded quietly, the lump in my throat too big for words. Around me, the neighbors who had once turned a blind eye were now clapping, some even standing. A few faces were tearful, others just stunned. Maybe they finally realized what Rick had almost taken from all of us. Not just land, but trust, dignity, and freedom. As Sam packed up his papers, I turned toward the door. The bright morning sun outside the courthouse felt different now, like the weight of 100 storms had finally lifted. I stepped out into the light and breathed deep. Free, finally free. Back. At the ranch that evening, I walked the fence line, the the shadows of the setting sun stretching long over the fields Grandpa Tom had once plowed by hand. Everything looked the same. The weathered barn, the cattle grazing slow and easy, the hills rolling off into forever. But everything had changed, too. Not just for me, but for everyone in Green Valley Ranch Estates. Word spread fast. Within days, the HOA board collapsed. Honest folks were elected to rebuild it, people who remembered why they'd moved out here in the first place. For peace, for space, for freedom. Rick's empire of fear crumbled like a rotten fence post. As for Rick himself, he faced a long list of charges, and he wouldn't be seeing Green Valley again anytime soon. There was still work to do, still scars to heal, still fences to mend, literal and otherwise. But for the first time in a long while, when I sat on the porch at sunset with a cup of black coffee in my hand, I knew this land, my family's land, was safe. And as long as I drew breath, it always would be. The fight was over, and I had won. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. "Mr. Walker, how do you feel about the verdict? What are you going to do now?" they shouted. I shielded my eyes from the sun and answered simply, "I'm going home, back to my ranch, right where I belong." And I meant every word. Just as I climbed into my truck, Mrs. Langford appeared, shuffling over with her cane. "We're proud of you," she said warmly. "You reminded all of us what standing up really looks like." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Thank you, ma'am." Driving back down the dusty road to the ranch, everything seemed different, brighter, stronger, as if the land itself was proud of me. The barn still needed repairs, the field still needed tending, and the cattle still needed feeding, but my home was mine again. My family's legacy was safe, and no HOA president, no matter how greedy or powerful, could ever take that away from me or from anyone else, willing to stand and fight. Still, deep down, I knew I couldn't just return to the way things had been. Rick's corruption had hurt a lot of people, not just me. Maybe it was time someone cleaned up the HOA for good. Maybe it was time to turn the tables. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for me to run for HOA president. The idea gnawed at me like a dog with a bone. Run for HOA president. It sounded crazy. At first, after everything they'd put me through, why would I want to be part of that mess? But sitting on the porch that evening, looking out over the fields Grandpa Tom once tended with his bare hands, I realized it wasn't about power or revenge. It was about making sure no one else had to suffer like we did. If I didn't step up, someone just as bad as Rick could step into the vacuum he left behind, and the same bullying and corruption could start all over again, maybe even worse. Picked up the phone and called Sam Jenkins. "Sam," I said, "how hard is it to get on the ballot for HOA president?" He chuckled and said, "Easier than you think, Mason. All you need is a nomination and a handful of signatures. And after what just happened, I'd bet half the neighborhood would carry you into office on their shoulders." That gave me the boost I needed. The next morning, I made it official. I submitted my nomination papers and spent the next week going door to door, not just to campaign, but to listen. People had stories, so many stories. Mrs. Langford fined for her garden gnomes. The Ramirez family fined for having too many guests at their son's birthday party. An elderly veteran 2 streets. Overfined for flying his American flag too high on the pole. It hadn't just been me. Rick's HOA reign had terrorized the entire neighborhood. Now, people were ready for a change. On the day of the special election, the community center was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was electric, buzzing with hope instead of fear. I stood at the front wearing my Sunday boots. No fancy suit, just jeans, a clean shirt, and the same determination that had carried me through every battle so far. When my name was called, I stepped up to the microphone. I didn't give a long speech. I didn't have to. I simply said, "This land taught me that real leadership isn't about power. It's about service. It's about protecting people, not controlling them. If you trust me with this job, I'll make sure your voices are heard, all of them." That was it. When the votes were counted an hour later, the results were overwhelming. I won by a landslide. People cheered, clapped, even cried. I shook hands, until my arm nearly fell off. But there wasn't much time for celebrating. The very next morning, I got to work. I called an emergency board meeting and introduced new rules. No fines without a full board vote and a homeowner appeal, no property inspections without homeowner consent, no weapon bans that violated constitutional rights, full transparency of all HOA finances, and most importantly, a full independent audit of Rick Miller's time in office. The board approved every motion unanimously. Cleaning up the mess Rick had left behind wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was happening, really happening this time. A week later, the sheriff's office confirmed the criminal charges against Rick: fraud, theft, attempted arson, civil. Rights violations. He was looking at serious jail time. Meanwhile, the judge ordered all my stolen firearms returned to me, every single one, including the Civil War musket Grandpa Tom had prized so much. I built a special display case inside the house just for that musket. It stood as a reminder, a symbol not just of the fight I had won, but of the spirit Grandpa Tom had passed down, the spirit of standing your ground when everything's against you. One evening, after a long day spent rebuilding fences and clearing brush, I sat on the porch again, sipping coffee as the sunset painted the sky in gold and purple. Mrs. Langford walked up the drive carrying a fresh baked pie. I figured the new president could use a break, she teased. I chuckled and took the pie, setting it carefully on the table. We sat there for a while, watching the cattle graze, the barn standing proud against the horizon, the field stretching out as far as the eye could see. "This place," she said softly, "it feels different now, safer." I nodded. "It's not just the land, it's the people. You protect each other, you build something real." She smiled warmly. "Your grandfather would be proud." I smiled back, feeling a tightness in my chest I hadn't even realized was there. "Thank you," I said. Later that night, as the stars came out one by one, I walked down to the barn. I unlocked the doors. No more padlocks from thugs, no more fear. Inside, everything was where it belonged. Tools neatly hung, saddles polished, Grandpa Tom's old rocking chair sitting in the corner. I sat down in that chair, feeling its familiar creak beneath me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. The ranch was safe. My rights were safe. The community was healing. As the cool night breeze drifted through the open barn doors, I knew one thing for certain. No matter who tried to take it away, this ranch, this life, would always be worth fighting for. Because some things are too important to ever back down from. And sometimes the strongest walls aren't built with bricks or wood. They're built with heart.